What does it take to survive a life that seems designed to erase you? Is talent enough? Or does survival demand something harder, darker, and far less glamorous? And what happens when the public image of a man is not just different from who he really is, but deliberately constructed to keep people from looking closer? Robert Mitchum is remembered as Hollywood's ultimate rebel. Half-awake in interviews, dismissive of fame, allergic to ambition, and permanently unimpressed by success. That image became legend. But legends often exist to cover wounds. Because behind the drawl, the heavy eyelids, and the cultivated indifference lived a man shaped by hunger, loss, brutality, and silence. Experiences that don't fade just because the camera eventually loves you. This isn't mythology. These aren't rumors. These are 5 documented moments from Robert Mitchum's life. Moments that should have erased him long before Hollywood ever learned his name. And yet, they didn't. Why? 1. A death before memory. Losing his father at 18 months. Robert Mitchum's life began with a loss so sudden and violent that he would never consciously remember it, yet never escaped its gravity. On February 20th, 1919, his father, James Thomas Mitchum, was working as a railroad switchman at the Charleston Navy Yard in South Carolina. It was routine work. Familiar work. The kind that rarely makes headlines until something goes wrong. That day, something did. James slipped during a coupling operation. 2 boxcars closed in. He was crushed between them and died an hour later in the Navy Yard Hospital. The incident was reported the same day in local newspapers. Another small tragedy in an industrial world accustomed to swallowing men whole. Robert Mitchum was 18 months old. His mother, Anne Harriet Gunderson, was pregnant with their 3rd child. So ask yourself, what happens to a family when the foundation disappears overnight? What does grief look like when survival leaves no room for mourning? And didn't have the luxury of collapse. She had children to feed in a country that offered little sympathy to widows and even less to the poor. She moved constantly, Connecticut, Delaware, New York, working as a linotype operator, a skilled but exhausting trade dominated by men. The children were shifted between relatives, homes, and temporary shelters of emotional stability. There was no permanence, no stillness, no sense of, this is where we belong. In 1927, and remarried. But remarriage doesn't rewind childhood. It doesn't restore what never had time to form. Robert grew up without a father's voice, without a steady authority to push against in healthy ways. And in early 20th century America, boys without anchors didn't get therapy, they got labeled brilliant, defiant, unmanageable. He was expelled from schools in Delaware for violence. Later, from Heron High School in Manhattan's Hell's Kitchen for open rebellion against authority. This wasn't attention-seeking misbehavior. It was rage without language. Instinct without guidance. The irony is almost cruel. His father died the same way countless nameless men died, crushed by trains. And within a decade, Robert Mitchum would be riding those same trains, sleeping on the same steel, risking the same fate. Was it coincidence? Or was he unconsciously chasing the shape of a loss he could never remember, but always felt? 2. Sent away into the Great Depression. The myth says Robert Mitchum ran away. The truth is colder, and far more revealing. In 1931, when Robert was 14, his mother packed his suitcase. She made him a sandwich, and she sent him away. Not because she didn't love him, but because love does not always equal safety. The Great Depression had crushed any illusion of stability. Schools had failed him. Discipline had failed. Structure had failed. And, exhausted, pragmatic, cornered by history, made a decision shaped by survival rather than sentiment. So what does a 14-year-old do when the country itself is collapsing? What happens when adulthood has no answers left to offer? Robert became a drifter. Not the romantic kind, but the real kind. The kind shaped by cold steel and hunger. He rode freight trains across America. Flatbeds, boxcars, refrigerated cars, learning which ones would kill you if you slept wrong. Veteran hobos taught him how to steal food without being noticed, how to beg without humiliating yourself too much, how to avoid railroad police who didn't ask questions before swinging nightsticks. He worked anywhere work existed. Ditches, fruit fields, dishwashing, coal mines. The mines nearly broke him. Claustrophobia set in. The darkness pressed in. He fled. He boxed professionally. 27 documented fights broke his nose and permanently damaged his left eye. That famous heavy-lidded stare, the one critics later read as boredom or contempt, was the result of trauma, not attitude. He wasn't unimpressed. He was injured. Hunger taught him another lesson. Geography. Mitchum later admitted he learned the locations of American jails because sometimes jail was safer than the street. Warmer. Predictable. Indoors. This wasn't character building. It was endurance. And it all happened before he turned 16. So when people later accused Mitchum of laziness, did they ever ask how tired a person has to be before rest looks like apathy? 3. The chain gang escape that followed him for life. In the summer of 1933, 15-year-old Robert Mitchum jumped off a freight train in Savannah, Georgia. He was arrested almost immediately. His charge? Vagrancy. Labeled a dangerous and suspicious character with no visible means of support, he was beaten with a nightstick and sentenced to 180 days on a Georgia chain gang in Chatham County. The camp sat in Pipe Maker Swamp, a place designed not to rehabilitate, but to extract labor until bodies failed. Mosquitoes carried disease. Heat crushed the lungs. Prisoners worked 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, for one meager meal. Guards tightened leg irons until they cut into flesh. Within days, Mitchum's ankles became infected, wounds running from heel to knee. Men around him died from tuberculosis, swamp fever, gangrene. So ask yourself, how does a 15-year-old survive something designed to kill grown men? During road work, guards briefly removed the leg irons. Mitchum waited, watched, calculated. Then he ran. Gunshots cracked behind him as he disappeared into the tree line. He hitchhiked north, eventually reaching family in Delaware. The infection nearly cost him his leg. He walked on crutches for weeks. But here's the detail history almost forgets. When Mitchum returned to Savannah in 1961 to film Cape Fear, he was technically still a fugitive from that chain gang. Director J. Lee Thompson later noted Mitchum carried visible rage during the shoot. That menace, the coiled violence, the sense that brutality could erupt at any second, wasn't entirely acting. Memory was working. So when audiences felt unsettled watching him, was it because he was performing evil, or because he understood it too well? 4. The arrest that was meant to end him. By 1948, Robert Mitchum was a major Hollywood star, earning $3,000 a week at RKO Pictures. And Hollywood was looking for an excuse. On August 31st, LAPD narcotics officers raided a cottage in Laurel Canyon. Inside, they found Mitchum smoking marijuana with a young actress and 2 others. But this wasn't random. Mitchum had been under surveillance for 8 months. The house was bugged for 5. An informant, never charged, lured him there. Newspapers were tipped off before the arrest happened. By the time Mitchum reached the police station, photographers were already waiting. When asked his occupation, he replied calmly, "Former actor." He was convicted and sentenced to 60 days. He served 1 week in county jail and 43 days at the sheriff's honor farm. Hollywood expected his career to die. Instead, audiences surprised them. Howard Hughes rushed a shelved Mitchum film into theaters as a test. It became RKO's biggest hit of the year. Viewers reportedly applauded when Mitchum appeared on screen. The woman arrested alongside him received the same sentence, and never worked in major films again. Power decided who survived. In 1951, Mitchum's conviction was overturned after the arrest was exposed as a setup. He never publicized it. Why not clear his name? Why let the stain remain? Perhaps because Mitchum understood something Hollywood never did. Survival doesn't require vindication. 5. The masterpiece nobody wanted, and the man nobody knew. In 1955, Mitchum starred in The Night of the Hunter, directed by Charles Laughton. Today, it's considered one of the greatest films ever made. At the time, it failed. Critics dismissed it. Audiences stayed away. The loss devastated Lawton so completely he never directed another film. But behind the scenes, something unexpected happened. Despite his public image of indifference, Mitchum later called it his finest performance, and Lawton his greatest director. Because Lawton struggled directing children, Mitchum quietly stepped in, guiding them himself, protecting the performances that would later define the film. The lazy actor saved the production. The man who didn't care had been writing poetry since childhood. Published at 9. Interviewed for his work. A deeply literate, introspective artist hiding behind a mask of disinterest. Charles Lawton once said Mitchum could have been the greatest Macbeth of his generation. All the tough talk, he said, was a blind, closing reflection. So what do we really know about Robert Mitchum? Was he lazy, or simply unwilling to perform sincerity on command? Was he indifferent, or deeply private in a world addicted to exposure? And how many public images have we mistaken for truth because they were easier to accept? Mitchum once joked that when he died, anyone searching for meaning would find only a note that read, "Later." But maybe that was the point. Some lives aren't meant to be explained. They're meant to be survived. He was never the man the magazines wanted him to be. They preferred the shorthand, the sleepy-eyed scowl, the cigarette dangling at a dangerous angle, the gravel voice that suggested a life lived on the wrong side of every moral line. It made a good poster. It sold papers. It explained, in tidy strokes, a complicated life. But beneath that poster was a person who read Conrad in the bunk of a chain gang and wrote an oratorio staged at the Hollywood Bowl by a director who reshaped American theater. How do we hold two truths at once? That a face can be a mask and also a window. How does a life come to be simplified by other people's shorthand, and what is lost in that simplification? He began, as all myths do, in the slant light between legend and fact. As a teenager he survived hobo camps and fights and the daily tuition paid in bruises and scrap iron. He learned the theatrical economy of silence, the way a single look can say what 100 lines cannot. He learned music the same way, by ear, by memory, by communion with those who made it in bars and back alleys. That memory, the photographic recall he inherited from his mother, let him read a page once and make it his. It made rehearsal unnecessary and misreadings rare. It also made him dangerous to those who expected surface. Which brings us to the early Strange Triumph, a 22-year-old who collaborated with Orson Welles to stage an oratorio at the Hollywood Bowl. Imagine it, a young man with no conservatory pedigree, no glossy endorsements, staking a claim beside the most imaginative theatrical mind in America. What does that history do to the tidy myth of the roughneck actor? Why didn't we learn that version first? It's not simply contradiction we're after. It's pattern. The same man who could flatten a boxer in a bar could also translate Shakespeare with a tenderness that surprised colleagues. The same man who dodged scandal like a practiced swimmer would, in private, write poems and compose melodies that refused to be crude. The tension gave him gravity. Consider what it means to build an image in Hollywood. Costumers and publicity agents are craftsmen in chiaroscuro. They paint men as they want their audiences to see. But sometimes the man pushes back, not with petition or public statements, but with choices. He refused certain roles. He recommended other actors. He did not chase prestige in the way the press required. He chose, by principle or by stubbornness, to walk away from the parts that felt like betrayals. Why refuse the bright trophies when they arrive? Because belief has forms. For some the prize is validation. For others the prize is complicity. He refused Patton and later recommended George C. Scott for the role, because he believed he lacked the appetite for that kind of blazing intensity. He turned down Dirty Harry on principle, refusing to endorse a vigilante philosophy that felt to him like a charred moral incline. He rejected The Defiant Ones because a chain gang wasn't a prop for drama. It was a real wound he had lived through. What does it tell us when a star forfeits fame rather than betray a memory of suffering? How many of us would do the same? These refusals complicate the caricature of the man. They suggest he was not a creature of easy appetites. They show traces of a moral code mapped not from public acclaim but from hard, private experience. To walk away from roles that would have cemented his bankability doesn't fit the script of someone who didn't care. It fits the script of someone who cared too much about what stories were allowed to say. He carried violence the way some men carry a scar, not as a boast, but as knowledge. The episode in Colorado Springs, a brawl in a bar in the Alamo Hotel, exploded because a private became a world-ranked heavyweight, and the collision made for a headline. The man at the center of that headline gave two accounts. One, raw and unrepentant. One, weary and public-facing. Both were honest. The first lived in his private ledger, that when someone attacks you, sometimes the whole route is necessary. The second spoke to a career that could not survive perpetual scandal. Violence to him was not theatrical posturing. It was a grammar learned in Hell's Kitchen, a survival skill that translated awkwardly into movie sets and cocktail parties. It's easy to romanticize the tough guy image, to say he was authentic, while imagining that authenticity as a costume. But his toughness wasn't constructed for publicity. It predated cameras. It was forged by a life that did not offer reparations or easy elisions. Yet he loved music with a stubborn, almost private devotion. He wrote song lyrics for his sister, Julie Mitchum. He listened to calypso on the streets of Trinidad and to country records in Nashville, and he recorded an album that, at the time, failed. That album, a calypso collection released by Capitol Records, was not an exercise in appropriation. It was an attempt at translation. When he sat with Caribbean musicians in Trinidad and Tobago, he paid attention. He befriended local singers and absorbed a rhythm not as a consumer but as a student. Why does the media celebrate entries that fit an iconography and obscure the rest? Why did the calypso record disappear from the charts only to be reappraised decades later? The work itself didn't change. The attention did. That pattern recurs in his life. A creative move is dismissed, then decades later reconsidered as authentic, as if time can retroactively correct the glut of shorthand. There are stories embedded in the margins. One such story is his musical reach. The Ballad of Thunder Road, co-written and associated with his early film work, lingered on the Billboard charts for months. A country single he recorded later, Little Old Wine Drinker Me, was taken up by other singers and made a quietly unlikely mark. Years later, a young musician would see a film poster and name a song after it. Bruce Springsteen would later connect with the mythic motor of that film. These ripple effects speak to an influence that's quieter than headline fame, less immediately flashy but persistent. Relationships were the true tests of the man's contradictions. He married Dorothy Spence when they were very young, a marriage that lasted decades, through infidelity and trials and a life that, for him, had no comfortable script. The public loved the myth of the unattached rebel. The private life showed a long-term concern for a woman he returned to again and again. He joked about being a poor husband, and he owned it. He could not imagine life without her. How do we parse fidelity when it is tangled with a life of choices and errors? Is devotion measured in perfection or persistence? The length of that marriage, nearly 6 decades, argues for persistence. The fact that he returned to Dorothy when other relationships ended argues for attachment. That he wrote to music and poetry and walked away from roles because of principle suggests that his inner life was neither shallow nor idle. There are quieter, wilder moments too. In Trinidad and Tobago he fell into calypso's current the way someone might fall in love, wholly and without planning. He sat in bars listening to Lord Melody and Mighty Sparrow, paying attention to phrasing, timing, the little breaks that make rhythm human. He did not arrive as an exploitative tourist. He learned to translate the feel of the street into something that could survive a recording studio. The recording did not sell well. Critics at the time could not read what he was doing. Later listeners would understand. Why the change? Because cultural taste is not a straight timeline. Sometimes the market impatiently dismisses nuance until later critics correct the ledger. The failure of the Calypso album at the time was not, in other words, a failure of artistry so much as a failure of cultural attention. If we chart his career choices, we see a pattern of refusal and curiosity. He refused to play parts that felt dishonest. He turned down answers that would make him richer in the short term but poorer in the ledger of integrity. He said no to roles that would praise cruelty. He said yes to projects that allowed the smallest windows into the human conscience. This is a simple, stubborn ethics. Do no pieces that trade in lies. That ethic extends to an odd friendship with fame's machinery. Directors like Howard Hawks would later tell stories about him pretending not to care while he worked harder than anyone else. He asked his collaborators not to advertise the fact that he labored. His indifference was an artful drop to let others assume the limit of his involvement. It was a form of camouflage, not unlike the way a fish's dull skin hides a bright interior. He had a taste for paradox. He could be lethal in a fight and tender over a poem. He could refuse a role for moral reasons and then accept another precisely because it asked him to be complicated. He was a man who laughed and yet would not be laughed at easily. He remained, to the end, someone who preferred the drawer to the mantle. When he died, he left instructions against ceremony, preferring cremation and scattering at sea. Yet that small private ending could not stop the archive of his life from accreting meaning. His son, Chris Mitchum, called his life simply a good ride. That line is both elegy and understatement. We should ask, what does a life like that leave behind? Not just films or chart placings, though there are many of those. Not only a marriage that survived the temptations of fame, though that certainly counts. It leaves an outline of a man who refused to be reduced. It leaves evidence that public myth-making is an industry, and that personal truth sometimes resists its machinery. There are moral lessons embedded here, if you want them. One is that the stories we accept as true about public figures are often lazy. Another is that talent refuses neat categories. The man who stage-boxed on the streets could also write an oratorio. A third is that influence is not always glitzy. It moves in quiet invitations that later artists accept and revise. But there is a more intimate lesson that survives the gloss of fame. Watch how he loved music, not as a collection of assets or a branding tool, but as a language to be learned. Watch how he loved Dorothy, not as an ornament, but as a steady presence that survived infidelity and ego. Watch how he refused roles, as a small moral alchemy that refused to convert private pain into spectacle. Let us linger, finally, on an episode that shows these strands braided together. The mornings by the sea in his later years. Not much was written of those hours. He had asked for no memorial, a small departure. But survivors spoke of a man who would sit and listen to waves and light and the ordinary cadence of gulls. A man whose voice had once been described as a rictus of boredom, now softening into observation. There is a humility in that image, but also defiance. He had always, in private, been a maker. He wrote poems. He composed. He arranged rhythms in the margins of scripts. He once joked about drawers that contained nothing of consequence but a note saying, "Later." That was a self-mockery that suggested both an awareness of legend and an impatience with it. He wanted the work to live without his hand on the lever of legend. When his ashes were scattered at sea, salt and wind became the archive. A cenotaph later appeared in a small town near where he first met Dorothy, a tidy place for visitors to leave flowers and dedications. But the real memorial is less tidy. It is the messy patchwork influence on musicians and actors and ordinary people who watched his films and misread him and later, perhaps, understood. It is the record of a man choosing humility and generosity in private while allowing the world to invent stories about him in public. How should we remember that? Do we honor the myth because it is convenient, or do we scrape at the varnish and insist on a more complicated picture? For anyone who cares about the work, and perhaps that is the smallest, most enduring claim, the answer should be the latter. Consider the man's refusal to squander the past for a quick headline. When the cameras wanted the mask, he offered only a fragment. When directors demanded spectacle, he offered craft. When the world demanded easy narratives, he supplied contradictions. Those contradictions are not evasions. They are the contours of a life lived in full. What do we take from that? Maybe this, that a life of art need not be a life of performance. That the most interesting people often refuse the parts that would make them easiest to sell. That courage sometimes looks like saying no. And then there are the questions that stick in the throat. If the real man hid under the carefully constructed image, why did so many of us prefer the mask? Did we find comfort in its simplicity? Or did the industry groom us to prefer stories with clear, consumable edges? If one wants to find him now, the route is easy and the discovery is slow. Watch the films and listen for an economy of silence. Read the poetry and notice the hands that reach but do not demand. Play the calypso record and hear a man of another country learning a new grammar. Let the evidence accumulate, not as rumor but as artifact. In the end, he left work, 120 films, songs, poems, and a marriage that lasted far beyond the prepackaged myths. He left choices that spoke of a man unwilling to trade his inner ledger for the glare of awards. He left a stubborn refusal to be simple. So when someone asks whether he cared, we can answer with a refusal to reduce. He cared in ways the headlines could not hold. In principled refusals, in quiet music, in a long and imperfect marriage, in the terse requests for a private ending. He was not the myth, but he was also not the opposite of it. He was whole, and whole things do not fit well on a poster. What will you do with a life like that? Will you let the easy story stand, or will you spend the trouble to find the contradictions? Will you read the poems and listen to the calypso and, perhaps, let yourself be surprised? These are not merely biographical inquiries. They are invitations to resist the tidy, to listen for puzzles, and to believe that a man who once flattened a boxer in a bar could also be the mind no one was supposed to notice.